we'd like
Thank
to spend
you.
a few minutes now having discussions or raising questions that the group can talk about. The first question I would like to pose is in terms of the health of Port Royal Sound. The indications are that at the present time, it's a healthy system. I'd like to go around with the presenters and have them just comment about what they think might be some of the most imminent threats and or unanswered questions that need to be answered in order to respond to that point. So with that, I'll go back through and talk with Andrew, Denise. Y'all talked about the large scale patterns, and you had the CCAT data and the GIS data. If you could make some comments about imminent concerns or unanswered questions that would be helpful in how to monitor and protect Port Royal Sound. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly something that we've been trying to understand through our research, not only through Port Royal Sound and some of the stormwater work that you helped us with starting in 2014, also up in the Charleston region. I think, as I alluded to in my presentation, the effects of the rapid rate of development are where I'm kind of looking the most. Potential stormwater concerns. I think we're very fortunate to have an environment that's largely intact and largely in great shape. So thankfully, most of what we can focus on is preserving rather than restoring things.
Okay. Thanks, Denise. From your observations on many fronts, what would you like to add?
So I echo those concerns, and certainly, making the relationships and better understanding how stormwater and just people are altering the landscape, and then ultimately the upland landscape, and then ultimately altering the sort of seascape. And then, as I said at the end of my talk, I think salt marshes, I think we have an abundance of those. And so we haven't spent a lot of time conducting really intensive research projects in them. But as time goes on and we see sea level rise and we see other impacts on them, I think we need to start better understanding how their health as well.
Great. Peter, you did a great job of giving us an overview about the role of oysters. From a shellfish perspective, what would be things that you see of special concern going forward, and or things that we need to learn more about as relate to shellfish, obviously including oysters?
I think one thing that springs to mind is something that we're working with our management side of the shellfish group on, which is trying to find out what sort of sustainable levels of harvest are for particular shellfish grounds, and pursuing sort of additional tools in our sort of management belt in order to keep some of those grounds open. What typically happens right now is grounds are open, they become harvested, and then they need to be closed in order to recover. And we don't have a lot of variation around that. So really it's sort of an on-off switch, if you will. And so one of the things that this SCOTA program data is being used for in terms of understanding sort of population dynamics is to try and understand what sort of a sustainable level of production of oysters could be on those grounds. And while that might sound very sort of fisheries driven, if we can keep some of those commercially harvested grounds in more sustainable condition so that we don't have to close them, while they're being harvested, while they're in better condition, they will still be supporting all of those ecosystem services through their filtration and their provision of habitat. So I think that's one thing that we're working on a lot in terms of oysters, in terms of having sort of greater flexibility in terms of how those grounds are opened and closed. And that sort of ties into the fact that a significant portion of our state's fisheries do occur within sort of Port Royal Sound area. So, and then the other thing, I guess, was just sort of a broader appreciation of some of the other sort of filter feeding bivalves that occur in the system. Obviously, there's a lot of attention on oysters because they're iconic, but there are a number of other species that we don't have as much data on. Hard clams is kind of a good example. We don't have any sort of rigorous mapping of where the hard clam beds are in any of the state, really. So those would be a couple of things.
All right, whole nother professional life to take care of that.
Yeah, I'm still young.
And we do know that there's extensive hard clam beds in Port Royal Sound because I've had friends that have been out harvesting them. So that's very appropriate for Port Royal Sound. Thanks. Michael, with crustaceans we know are highly sensitive to pesticides, and specifically insecticides and other things. They're also very important from the public's perspective. So there's a lot of harvesting going on as well. What would you want to add as far as how using crustaceans is something to what do we need to be concerned about the health, and what do we need to learn more about?
Yeah, these are really important invertebrates in the estuarine environment, and sort of fundamentally a lot of this comes right off of what Andrew and Denise are saying about the importance of these sort of headwater tidal creeks and salt marshes to supporting the estuarine food web, right? I think it's important to understand how shrimp and blue crab fit within that broader food web perspective, that broader ecosystem perspective, and thus allowing us to better understand how these two species, sort of representative iconic species, may respond to future changes and things like land use, but also sea level rise. So starting there, and that's particularly right, these salt marshes as sort of nursery habitats. These are these sort of young life stages, but also, as I mentioned in my talk, understanding how those young life stages recruit to the sort of harvestable adult size, getting more information on what those recruitment dynamics look like, so we can better link what's happening with those early life stages in those headwater tidal creeks and salt marshes to what's going on with those populations as they sort of reach larger harvestable sizes.
Okay, great. And I'm gonna, Joey and Elizabeth, since you're all both the fish people, I'll toss it out collectively to both of you. Obviously, y'all, the area of fish encompasses a lot of different species and different forms of fish, many of which are being harvested, as well as relying on the food web. So if you would care to comment, you can go as long as you like. We'll cut you off.
All right. I guess I'll take a stab at that. I mean, fisheries, the management of fisheries has predominantly and historically been driven by the interactions between humans catching the fish and how that is affecting the biology or the productivity or the abundance of the fish in the different water bodies. I think with climate change, we're starting to potentially see fundamental shifts in the productivity of some of these systems. And that's going to be a big question moving forward. Obviously, the Northeast region right now has been dealing with that a lot more at this point in time, as far as shifts in productivity, as far as controlling how productive the system can be. There's sort of a growing body of literature that's even in this area suggesting that there's some shifts in timing of plankton blooms, shifts in dominant wind patterns, or basically a delay or delay in this shift in the wind patterns, et cetera, that can be really important to controlling the recruitment of a lot of these finfish species that are using the estuaries, and better understanding those dynamics and how that's impacting overall productivity of the system is going to be important. And on the flip side, we have everything flows downhill. So what's happening up in the uplands, ultimately, this is affecting the water quality, which is affecting the crustaceans, which ultimately is going to end up being affecting the fish as well. So I think it's just going to be important to sort of try to tease out the various stressors that may be on these systems and how that may be impacting the overall productivity for individual species or the ecosystem overall.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, the red drum, is such an iconic species, but also so abundant. And so the lessons you're learning at the Maritime Center about, or have learned through your work and Al Stokes, who preceded you and got the Waddell lab up and running. What would you like to know more about in terms of not just red drum, but mariculture in general? You've been working with multiple species. What unanswered questions would you like to share, maybe in addition to what you described in your talk? What are the other or horizons for research there?
I think certainly, especially with our hatchery that's newly renovated, within the past several years, that we have the ability now that wasn't here before. We didn't even have climate control in our hatchery facility. So we now have the ability to tease out some of the biological and physical parameters that are affecting the success of various species of fishes in our estuaries. Like Joey was referring to, learning more about these dynamics, so we can specifically design challenge experiments in our small system. We have 20 replicate tanks. We can design experiments and ask questions about what are the limiting factors, and with specific reference to the Port Royal Sound that's experiencing this incredible development. And these larval and juvenile fishes are highly dependent for their growth in their early phases of life on these small tidal creeks. So those are really, really important nursery areas. So I think that's extremely important. As a mariculture group, one of our objectives is stock enhancement of these recreationally important species of fish, but that should never be relied upon as the only mechanism to continue to facilitate the success of these species. We need to make sure that we understand the biology of the wild populations, and that we manage towards that, towards conserving and protecting them.
Right. Eric, you talked on several different topics. I think one of the things that I'm particularly fascinated with the underwater soundscapes is our snapping shrimp, since they're both crustaceans and also sound producers. And so if you would just make any observations you want to share, or anything about what you'd like to know more as far as what shrimping, monitoring snapping shrimp, using underwater sounds, and questions to ask about them. That would be the first question I'd ask you. And then we can move to fish.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, snapping shrimp are the primary sound producer that we see in our soundscapes. They produce sounds by snapping their claw, and that creates a bubble, and that creates a sound that sounds like snap, like Rice Krispies. We think that they're producing those sounds as part of their foraging tactic to stun prey, but it also might be as used in territorial displays. One thing we see with snapping shrimp that's really fascinating is that they exhibit, because they're ectotherms, they're not as active in the winter time. So we see clear, distinct seasonal patterns in snapping shrimp snaps, which leads to our high differences in high frequency sound pressure levels, because the snaps can be quantified just by looking at that particular bandwidth. They also exhibit lunar rhythms and tidal rhythms. So we hear a lot of snapping shrimp on the low tide, which is interesting. The other really cool thing with snapping shrimp that we noticed, we haven't published it yet, we've been working on publishing it, is that when the salinity drops, we see a big decrease in snapping behavior. So that's an interesting, we're not sure why that is. Is it like a change in their, change in prey, or is it actually cause some mortality? I don't know. But that was a really interesting pattern that we observed. We tend to see less snapping shrimp in headwaters, and more towards the mouth of the May. And we don't think it's related to more of an area in which it's covered. I think it's just something to do with there's not as many up in the headwaters. That's a lot about snapping shrimp, but interesting organisms. We've caught them. We worked with some folks at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution that captured them and learned more about their sound pressure levels in captivity. It was cool. So yeah, snapping shrimp.
All right. So in terms of Port Royal Sound, you mentioned about red drum only bred at the mouth of the May River site, appears, and it was these deep holes. Any thoughts about the role of deep holes, and do we think red drum are breeding in other areas of Port Royal Sound besides that particular area?
Yeah. Well, we've only looked at the May River. We've only done really detailed spatial studies in the May River, and Chichesse Creek. So we can only say that in those areas, the only locations that we detect chorusing red drum is at the mouth of the May River. Now, the mouth of the May River is 70 feet deep. In the wintertime and in the summer, really, we see a congregation of dolphins there. So I think those deep areas are definitely congregations of where a lot of species are. I think that they're kind of like these little hot pockets of life. Be neat to study more, study a little bit more of those mouth, those areas. But like I said, it'd be, I think Joey could probably tell a little bit more about red drum spawning sites along the eastern seaboard. Like I said, the only one that we've detected is at the mouth of the May River, because that's the one we've studied. In the Charleston Harbor, we've got some near the Ravenel Bridge, I think. Maybe there's some indications that's kind of coming up in a new paper. And I believe that Bill Rumelet and Brock did some acoustics work, and they found some red drum spawning aggregations out by the grillage.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned, of course, you've already in your talk, you mentioned about the importance of the forest in terms of managing, excess stormwater. Anything else you want to add or comment on related to the studies that you've done? I'll give Alyssa a chance to also talk about, mention anything about dolphin monitoring.
I think it's, I think it would be really advantageous. I think Denise and Andrew are heading in this direction, but I think it's really important to correlate land use changes with water quality, and then maybe taking the next step with diversity and abundance of marine organisms, if that's possible. But I think, land use changes are, I think we need to, if we can show that, and they have, I think now it's sort of in the direction of like, okay, from a policy perspective, what can we do to protect more land, more forested land, especially locally? I really would like to see that as a big initiative in Beaufort County, is like really trying to purchase land and preserve it.
Yeah. And just to add to it there, the way we started the symposium was showing that the watershed of Port Royal Sound includes a great deal of area north and west of I-95. And I do know that the land conservation groups are now coalescing and working to try to preserve that area, because so much of that could potentially have an impact on Port Royal Sound as well. So it'd be great. All right, Alyssa, anything as far as the dolphin monitoring or behaviors you've observed or movement patterns that have interested you or you'd like to learn more about?
I definitely think in terms of what we know about the dolphins, that the interesting story is gonna be linked to their prey. So the productivity of all of their prey species and how that's affecting their vocalization and abundance. And in terms of our dolphin acoustic work, we've collected all this data, but I feel like we're barely scratching the surface on what this story is. And we're really starting to understand the baseline patterns, but in terms of how these patterns are affected by prey abundance and climate variability, that's something that we'll see as we continue to collect this data and hopefully kind of tell more of this story.
Okay, great, thanks. And Felicia, shorebirds in Port Royal Sound. What questions would you like to see answered or areas of research to be pursued?
Well, I think across the entire state, we need more surveys, including Port Royal Sound. But as you know, kind of as my talk kind of focused on also understanding how birds move across the entire coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and sort of see that whole system, the bite, as just a place they may spend one day. So they fly from the Arctic, they fly to the tip of South America. Some birds, red knots, fly 20,000 miles using all the estuaries, even within one day may be possible. So I'm pretty excited about this project we're working on right now to try to tie a lot of places we're working together.
Okay, great. And I sort of thought I'd do sort of full circle. We started with you, Will, and I know that you asked different kinds of questions than maybe some of the other people do. But since we've been out looking at a pit of sand trying to read what was going on, I think it'd be interesting for you to share what kind of questions the coastal geologists are looking at in terms of much longer trends than the ones we're talking about here. Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, since we look comparatively really far in the past, we've seen, thanks to the mapping inland, where marshes have been and approximately geologically when they've been there. So there's a long history of marshes inland. And for the Broad River, particularly in the Coosawhatchee, we've mapped in the last 100,000 years of geologic time, there's salt marshes all the way up to Ridgeland and Hardyville. So the area has a history of great expanses of estuarine systems. The question now, which will take the rest of our lives and probably several generations down the road to find out, is the current rate of relative sea level rise that I alluded to earlier slow enough to continue to keep the system the way we see it now? If sea level rise accelerates too far, it could overwhelm the marsh system as we know it and convert large platforms of saltgrass into open water. And the number of hectares that we currently have will be dramatically cut. We'd still have a marsh of some type. It might just be a bathtub ring around all the highlands with large open areas of water, much larger than today. So it'll still be here in some form, but you know what we don't exactly know in our science, what's that tipping point? When is the water coming in too fast for the system to keep up? We've been working for 20 years now gathering that type of data focused on the St. Helena Sound, and we've expanded it more up and down the coast. But just because it's been just two of us working on this project, we haven't been able to do much in specifically in the Port Royal Sound to look at that in the same time frame. But that's, to me, the big question to answer. One is, will we keep these large platforms, these huge areas of nursery that we currently have, or are we going to end up with a great big area to water ski in? The other bit is that I mentioned about the fault, the Garner-Edisto fault, which appears to control the north edge of the Ace Basin. And it intersects right there where the Broad River goes from a wide body of water to just the two little rivers coming in at its very uppermost reach. Is that point fault controlled? As a geologist, I haven't mapped that particular little corner yet to find out if that's the case. So that's something I'd personally really like to know. It won't change the world by finding that answer, but it would make me very happy.
Great. Well, with that, I want to again thank all of our presenters. They put a great deal of time in preparation. Everyone's slides have been and visuals have been fantastic. Each talk has been absolutely great. So we very much want to thank you for making this day possible. I also want to thank all of those who joined us via Zoom. And I hope that you got what you were looking for in terms of the talks and the presentations. I think there's two goals here that we both accomplished. One is to bring together the current knowledge about these particular topics of the Port Royal Sound so we can better understand what we know, and two, to showcase what needs to be looked at next and the value and the importance of doing research, because one of the things we kept hearing is each estuary is different from another. These tidal creeks can be different from each other, and the devil's in the details, so to speak. So we really need to be able to have continued support for long-term monitoring. In many cases, federal funds are not available for long-term monitoring projects. They like to fund things that are 2 to 4 years or maybe 5 years. And so having local support and initiative, both at the state level and more local level, to help make those long-term monitoring programs available and to expand them so we can get the information we need to protect Port Royal Sound is going to be extremely important. So with that, Jody, as the Executive Director of the Port Royal Sound Foundation, give you an opportunity to say any final words and to sign us off.
Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been involved. I know this took a lot of time for you guys to put everything together. You know, we wrote a grant a couple of years ago to Dominion Energy, which we were very excited to receive. And part of that funding has gone through putting together the symposium. So it's been a long time in the making, and we couldn't have done it without Chris Marsh for helping us organize and put together this fantastic panel. So we really look forward to working with you guys moving forward in the future. The foundation, as you all know, we're getting more involved in the research side of bringing the Port Royal Sound to the forefront and really getting you guys to help us prioritize what needs to be done to help protect it for the future. So thank you all. I really appreciate your help, and hope you all have a great weekend.